My mother said it on Christmas Eve, right in front of my children. We were standing in her living room, surrounded by wrapping paper and the smell of pine needles, and my two kids were waiting by the tree for their turn to open presents. When the chaos finally settled, my mother reached under the tree and pulled out two small boxes. She handed one to my daughter Sophie, who was 7, and one to my son Marcus, who was 5. They opened them carefully, the way kids do when they're hoping for something special. Inside each box was a pair of plain white socks, not even nice socks, the kind you buy in bulk at the dollar store. 3 pairs for $2. My daughter looked up at me, confused. My son's lips started to tremble, and my mother, seeing their faces, shrugged and said the words I'll never forget. "Don't look at me like that. Your sister's kids are my real grandchildren. These two are just extras." She said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Like she hadn't just told my children they were worthless in front of the entire family. I looked at my sister, waiting for her to say something. She was busy helping her youngest set up his new gaming console. She didn't even look up. My father was in his recliner, pretending to be asleep. Nobody said a word. I knelt down next to my kids. Sophie was trying not to cry. Marcus was holding his socks like they might turn into something better if he squeezed hard enough. "Get your coats," I said quietly. "We're leaving." My mother laughed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's Christmas." I didn't respond. I drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see her standing on the porch with her hands on her hips, looking annoyed. Not sorry. Annoyed. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong. 5 years later, she found me through my cousin and called crying, begging to meet her grandchildren. Said she'd made mistakes. Said she was dying and needed to see them before it was too late. I told her I'd ask the kids. Sophie was 12 by then. Marcus was 10. I sat them down and explained that their grandmother wanted to see them. Sophie looked at me with those serious eyes she'd developed and said, "The one who called us extras?" I nodded. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "No, I don't want to see her." Marcus shook his head too. "She made me cry on Christmas. I don't want to." I called my mother back that night. "They said no," I told her. "They remember what you said. They don't want a relationship with you." She started sobbing. "They're just children. They don't get to decide." "Actually," I said, "they do. You taught them they weren't real family. They believed you." I hung up, and I felt nothing but peace. Let me take you back, because this story isn't about Christmas presents or dollar store socks. It's about growing up as the lesser daughter, marrying the wrong man according to everyone's standards, and raising children who my mother decided weren't worthy of her love. If you've ever watched your kids be treated as second class by your own family, if you've ever been told your children matter less because of who their father is, you already know this isn't just about me. It's about every mother who's had to shield her children from the people who should have loved them most. My sister Deborah was born 3 years before me. From the beginning, she was the one my mother understood. "You weren't planned," she said. "Deborah was wanted. You just happened." I learned young that there were different levels of belonging in my family, and I was on the lowest one. When I was 8 and Deborah was 11, our grandmother passed away and left us each a small inheritance, $5,000 each, to be held until we turned 18. Except when Deborah turned 18, my mother let her access the money early to buy a car, a nice used Honda that she drove all through college. When I turned 18 and asked about my inheritance, my mother looked confused. "We used that for the roof repair 2 years ago. You knew that." I didn't know that. Nobody had told me. Nobody had asked. $5,000 I'd been counting on for college textbooks. Gone. Deborah got a car. I got nothing. When I tried to argue, my father told me to stop being greedy. The roof was for everyone, he said. I should be grateful I had a roof over my head. High school was more of the same. Deborah was homecoming queen, prom committee, dated the quarterback. My mother went to every dance, helped her shop for dresses, took hundreds of photos. I was in the art club, worked part-time at a craft store, saved money for supplies my parents wouldn't buy. When I won a regional art competition, my mother forgot to come to the award ceremony. She'd taken Deborah to get her nails done for a date. You understand, she said later. Deborah needed me. You're so independent. I was 16 years old and I'd just won first place for a painting I'd worked on for 3 months. I understood perfectly. I understood that I would never matter the way my sister did. College was supposed to be my escape. I got accepted to a state school with a partial scholarship for art. My parents said they couldn't help with the remaining costs because they were saving to help Deborah with her wedding. She'd gotten engaged at 21 to a man named Richard whose family owned a chain of car dealerships. He was exactly what my mother wanted for her daughter. Wealthy, connected, impressive at parties. They had a wedding that cost $40,000. My parents contributed $15,000 of it. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my own education and graduated with $30,000 in student debt. Nobody came to my graduation. Deborah was pregnant with her first child, and my mother couldn't possibly leave her side during such an important time. I met William during my junior year. We got married at the courthouse when I was 24 with his parents as witnesses. Mine didn't come. My mother said she couldn't support a decision she knew I'd regret. Sophie was born when I was 26. My mother came to the hospital, looked at my daughter, and said, "She has his nose. That's unfortunate." Those were her first words about my firstborn child. Deborah's first child had been born 2 years earlier. My mother had been in the delivery room, had cried tears of joy, had posted dozens of photos calling him my perfect grandson. She stayed at Deborah's house for 3 weeks helping. She stayed at mine for 4 hours, criticized how I was holding Sophie, and left. Marcus came 2 years later. By then, I'd learned to expect nothing. My mother sent a card with $20. She didn't meet Marcus until he was 3 months old, held him for 2 minutes at a family gathering before going to play with Deborah's children. The inequality was constant. Deborah's kids got elaborate birthday parties at expensive venues, funded by my parents. Sophie and Marcus got cards with $10 if my mother remembered. Deborah's kids had a dedicated playroom at my parents' house. When Sophie asked to play with those toys during visits, my mother said they were for the other grandchildren. I started spacing out visits. Once a month became once every few months. My mother barely noticed. William saw what I couldn't. "You come back from every visit looking smaller," he said, "like she takes pieces of you." The Christmas Eve disaster was preceded by months of small cruelties I'd been cataloging without realizing it. I'd sent her a professional family portrait 2 weeks earlier. She'd forgotten, she said. She'd add them next year. She never did. Deborah's son's baseball games were events my parents attended religiously, even driving 3 hours for away games. Marcus played soccer. My parents came to 1 game in 4 years, left at halftime, and my mother said afterward that soccer was boring compared to baseball. When Christmas approached that year, I almost didn't go. William suggested we start our own tradition, just the 4 of us, away from people who made us feel small. But Sophie had asked about seeing her grandmother, and I thought maybe this year would be different. Maybe my mother would see how big Sophie was getting, how smart Marcus was becoming, and something would shift. I was still hoping, even after everything. That's the cruelest thing about wanting your mother's love. You keep hoping long after the evidence says you should stop. I spent weeks choosing presents, carefully selected gifts for everyone, including my sister's kids, because that's who I am. I wrapped them beautifully, I drove 2 hours through light snow with holiday music playing and my children singing along in the back seat. I walked into that house actually believing things might be different. The gifts were the first sign. Under my mother's enormous tree, there was a clear division. One side had dozens of beautifully wrapped presents, all tagged for Deborah's children. The other side had a small cluster of modestly wrapped packages for the adults, and 2 tiny boxes off to the side. I counted. Deborah's 3 kids had at least 15 presents each. My 2 kids had 1 each. I told myself maybe my mother had planned to give them more presents later. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe I was being paranoid. Then the unwrapping began. Deborah's kids went first, as always. Each gift was more extravagant than the last. An iPad for the oldest, a bike for the middle child, an enormous dollhouse for the youngest, clothes from expensive stores, video games, sports equipment. My mother sat beaming, taking photos, saying things like, "Nothing's too good for my babies." Sophie and Marcus watched with wide eyes. They weren't jealous kids, but they were kids. They saw the abundance. They waited for their turn. When my mother finally handed them those small boxes, I still had hope. Maybe it was jewelry for Sophie. Maybe it was something special for Marcus. Small boxes sometimes held big things. But no. Socks. Plain white socks. The kind you see in bins at discount stores. While their cousins played with tablets and assembled dollhouses, my children held socks and looked at me for explanation. And my mother said those words. "Your sister's kids are my real grandchildren. These 2 are just extras." The room went silent for 1 second. Then life continued as if nothing had happened. Deborah helped her youngest with the dollhouse. My father kept his eyes closed. My brother-in-law Richard opened a bottle of wine. Only my children and I existed in that frozen moment, that crystallized instant where I finally understood that hoping was pointless. My mother had said out loud what she'd shown through actions for years. My children were not her grandchildren. They were extras, afterthoughts, obligations she'd rather not have. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I felt a strange calm wash over me, the way you feel when a storm finally breaks after hours of threatening. This was the end. Not of my pain, but of my participation in my own mistreatment. I was done. The drive home was quiet. Sophie asked me why Grandma didn't love her. I didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 7-year-old because it didn't make sense to a 33-year-old either. I just said, "Sometimes people can't love the way they should. It's not your fault. It's never your fault." Marcus fell asleep clutching his socks. I cried silently the whole way home, tears sliding down my face while Christmas lights blurred past the windows. William was waiting when we got back. He'd stayed home because my mother made him feel unwelcome, and he'd learned that his absence made the visit slightly easier for me. I walked in the door and he took one look at my face and just held me. The kids went to bed. I told him everything. When I got to the part about the socks and what my mother said, his jaw tightened in a way I'd never seen before. "That's it," he said. "They don't get access to our family anymore." I nodded. I'd already made the same decision in my mother's living room. The next morning, I blocked my mother's number. Then my father's. Then Deborah's. I sent one email to my mother explaining that we would not be visiting or communicating further, and that she should not attempt to contact us. I told her exactly why. I quoted her words back to her. I described my children's faces when they opened their socks while their cousins opened iPads. I wrote 3 pages of every slight, every inequality, every moment she'd made it clear my children were less than. Then I pressed send and closed my laptop and felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. She called from different numbers for weeks, sent letters I threw away unopened. Had Deborah tried to reach me through social media with messages about how I was tearing the family apart and punishing Mom for nothing? I ignored all of it. Slowly, the attempt stopped. Silence settled over that part of my life, like snow, quiet and clean. The next 5 years were the best of my life. Without the constant comparison, the subtle put-downs, the trips that left me feeling hollowed out, I flourished. We all did. I'd been doing freelance graphic design for years, fitting it around family obligations. Without that weight, I built a real business, took on bigger clients, created a portfolio. Within 2 years, I had a steady roster of small businesses who relied on me for their branding. William got promoted twice. We paid off my student loans, bought a house with a yard. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, earned by us, unshadowed by anyone's judgment. The kids thrived most of all. Sophie discovered a talent for writing. Her teachers called her gifted. Marcus found his thing in building. Legos first, then complex models, then an interest in mechanics. He took apart an old radio at 8 and put it back together at 9. Both had friends, did well in school, laughed easily. They were happy. We were all happy. And I realized something I should have understood years earlier. The absence of people who hurt you isn't loss. It's freedom. I heard occasional updates through my cousin Rachel, who understood family favoritism from her own experience. She told me my mother talked about me as the difficult daughter who'd abandoned the family over nothing. Told me Deborah's marriage had started having problems. Told me my parents were getting older, having health issues. I listened without feeling much of anything. They'd become characters in someone else's story. Then came the call. 5 years almost to the day from that Christmas Eve, Rachel gave me a heads up that my mother had been asking for my number, claiming it was urgent. I told Rachel not to give it out. 2 days later, my mother found my business email through my website and sent a message. The email was long. It started with her health. A cancer scare that had turned out to be benign but had made her think about mortality. Then vague regret about how things had gone. 3 paragraphs about how hard the last 5 years had been for her. She wanted to see Sophie and Marcus before it was too late. She wanted a chance. She didn't mention the socks. Didn't apologize for specific actions. Just wanted access to the grandchildren she'd once called extras. I read it 3 times, then showed it to William. He read it with that tight jaw he'd had 5 years ago. "What are you going to do?" I didn't know. He said whatever I decided, he'd support me. But he also said something that stayed with me. They're old enough to decide for themselves now. Maybe this should be their choice. He was right. Sophie was 12. Marcus was 10. They weren't the little kids who'd opened socks on Christmas Eve, too young to fully understand why their grandmother had called them extras. They were people now, with their own memories and their own feelings and their own right to decide who got access to their lives. I sat them down that weekend, explained that their grandmother had reached out, that she said she wanted to meet them, that she claimed to have regrets. I told them they didn't have to do anything they didn't want to, that whatever they decided, I would support, that there was no wrong answer. Sophie was quiet for a long time. She'd grown into such a thoughtful kid, the kind who processed internally before speaking. Finally, she asked, "Does she know what she did wrong?" I thought about the email, about the vague regrets and the focus on her own feelings. "I don't think she does," I said honestly. "Not really." Sophie nodded like that confirmed something. "Then I don't want to see her. She just wants to feel better about herself. She doesn't actually care about us." I didn't argue. I wasn't sure she was wrong. Marcus was more direct. "She made Sophie cry. She made you cry too, I remember. She gave us socks and called us extras. Why would I want to see someone like that?" He was 10 years old and already understood boundaries better than I had at 30. "I don't want to," he said firmly. "She's not my grandma. Grandma Johnson is my grandma." He meant William's mother, who'd stepped into the role my own mother had abandoned, who sent birthday presents that showed she actually knew my children, who called just to talk to them, who'd never once made them feel like extras. I wrote my mother back that night, kept it brief. "I shared your message with Sophie and Marcus and gave them the choice about whether to see you. They both said no. Sophie said you don't seem to understand what you did wrong, so meeting you would only be about making you feel better, not about them. Marcus said you called them extras, and he doesn't consider you his grandmother. I'm respecting their decision. Please don't contact us again." I pressed send. Felt that same peace I'd felt 5 years ago driving away from her house on Christmas Eve. She didn't accept it gracefully. Emails followed saying I'd poisoned my children, that they were too young to decide, that she had rights as their grandmother. I responded to none of them, set up a filter that sent her messages to trash, blocked her calls. Deborah tried next, full of righteous anger about how I was hurting our mother. I blocked her too. It's been 2 years since that last contact. My children are 14 and 12 now. Sophie wants to be a journalist. Marcus is building his own computer from parts. They're thriving, healthy, whole. They have grandparents who love them and William's parents, who treat them exactly the same as their other grandchildren because that's what decent people do. They have a family, just not the one I was born into. I don't spend much time thinking about my mother anymore. The anger faded years ago. What's left is something quieter. Understanding, maybe. She is who she is. She made her choices. She decided Deborah's children were her real grandchildren and mine were extras, and she said it out loud in front of them, and she lives with the consequences of that decision. The consequence is that she doesn't get to know who Sophie and Marcus have become, doesn't get to hear Sophie's laugh or Marcus's excited rambling about his latest project, doesn't get to be part of their lives in any way. She chose that. Not me. Her. I've thought sometimes about what I'd say if I saw her again, if we ended up in the same place by accident. I think I'd say nothing. There's nothing left to say. She knows what she did. Whether she admits it or not, she knows. And she knows that her grandchildren, the ones she called extras, made a choice not to see her. That has to sting more than anything I could say. It's not revenge. I didn't orchestrate it. I simply told my children the truth and let them decide. The truth was enough. Some people will tell you that family is everything, that you should forgive and forget. Those people usually haven't had a mother look at their children and call them extras in front of an entire room. They haven't watched their kids' faces fall on Christmas morning. Family isn't everything. Behavior is everything. The people who show up for you, who treat your children like they matter, those are your family. The rest is just genetics. My children know their worth now. They know it because I show them every day, because their father shows them, because their real grandparents show them. They didn't need my mother to teach them they mattered, but they'll always remember that she taught them they didn't. And when they were old enough to decide whether to forgive that lesson, they chose not to. That's not me poisoning them. That's her poisoning herself. If you've ever had your children treated as less than by your own family, this story is for you. If you've ever watched your kids be overlooked while others were celebrated, this is for you. If you've ever made the impossible decision to walk away from people who should have loved you but couldn't love you right, this is for you. Your children are watching. They're learning. And someday, they'll be old enough to decide for themselves who deserves their time and their hearts. Trust them to make good choices, and trust yourself for giving them the clarity to make them. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to protect your children from your own family? Did your kids eventually have their own say? I read every story. Subscribe for more stories about people who chose peace over pretending. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children isn't a grandmother. It's the knowledge that they deserve to be treated as more than extras.